made you say that?
Well, you got a book published. You're getting your podcast is actually functional. Those are two things that I don't have happening right now. So, see, you're ahead of the game.
Books published. Plus, the thing I just published is a short story. Well, a novelette.
Well, short story. Well, yeah, still published.
Yeah,
Someone
no,
paid you
it
for it,
feels
right?
good. I want more of that. I need an agent or somebody to find me all these little places that want fiction.
I know. I know. It's so
So hard.
overwhelming, isn't it? Just trying to
Yeah.
do that kind of thing on your own is just totally overwhelming.
I mean, I accidentally found this. I mean, I accidentally find a whole bunch of things, aim for it, but I mean, I wrote a novella and exhausted myself in like 6 weeks. It's a terrible experience, honestly.
You know what? Writing is kind of a terrible experience. It sounds really romantic. Being published is wonderful. The writing process is very painful and very hard.
Yeah. I mean, it has to be filled with self-doubt, right? I mean, you write a draft, you think it's 100% perfect, then you read it 2 days later, and you're just thankful you didn't give it to anybody to read because it's embarrassing.
Do you know what it's like? It's like when you're waiting in line for the roller coaster and you're like, I don't know if I should do this. Should I have done this? Should I do it? Yeah, I've totally, that looks so awesome. I'm totally gonna do it. And then you get up there and your heart starts racing. They strap you in, and you're just thinking, this was a huge mistake. This was a huge mistake. Why am I doing this? Let me off. I want off. And then the next thing you know, you're flipping upside down, and then you get to the end, and then you're like, oh, I should totally do that again.
That's how I felt about publishing my first novel.
That's what it feels like. It's horrible.
When I did the indie way, I mean, I went indie, I put it out there, I've ruined it. You know what I mean? It kind of sucks. If you do that and it doesn't like pop, you're basically wasting months and months of time. But it felt like that. It was like on top of this drop, going, okay, here we go. Let's see what happens.
And totally just the whole time, like, should I do this? Should I not do it? Why am I doing this? Why did I even agree? Why who talked me into this? I should never have done this.
The answer is always no, don't do it.
The answer is, but then if you don't do it, you'll never, you can't just sit around waiting for your, to become a writer, right? You got to do it. So it's just, it's such a romantic profession, but it is so painful.
Yeah. And you have to work so hard for nothing. I mean, you don't know if what you're doing will pan out.
For next to nothing. I mean, seriously, I do not make very much money on my books. And I have, 6 books out. I really don't make very much money on them. I get money for an advance when I write them.
Mm. And but you don't receive residuals or anything like that.
I do, but they're not very much compared to, I take supplemental editing and things like that just to not starve.
Make
sure my child has food.
Yeah, exactly. They say that you have to write just copious amounts of work, like 6 books a year is what they're saying now. You have to produce. If you want
or you have to have a bestseller. And then you're getting like royalties and movie rights and great things like that. And then your next book, they're going to give you a big fat $100,000 advance. Now, I don't know about you, but I've never had a job where I've made $100,000. So $100,000 advance in 1 year would be like amazing, right?
Yeah, but I live in New York, so everybody around me makes over $100,000. I'm the poorest person I know.
I know. Well, move to the Midwest. You'll be rich.
With working in a call center, though, that's pretty much all that's out there. It's horrible. I don't know how you're doing it. I mean, you went from San Francisco to Minneapolis. Minneapolis, right? Or Minnesota?
Yeah, Minneapolis. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. I mean, you must have gone through a culture shock at least.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I definitely, there's a culture shock. There's weather.
Right. Could you hear me at all? My freaking microphone was up on my head.
Yeah, I actually could hear you fine. Oh, you're so funny. Okay. So what do you want to talk about today? You want to talk about Charles Dickens, or did you want to just talk about, what do you want to talk about?
Well, it's the holiday season. I mean, we could talk about the holiday season. You have an appointment at noon, you said?
Yes, and I don't know. Let me just look at my calendar really quick, because I had everything screwed up. So, yeah, I have an appointment at 12:30.
12:30.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And I need a few minutes to get there. So, yeah.
No problem. Get my brain straight. I mean, basically, what we are looking at the holiday season. I think we've done this before last year anyway.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about, I can pull that up right now. What did we talk about last year for Christmas? That's how important your conversations are to me. I don't even know what we
No,
talked
it's
about.
fine. I know how many I subscribe to your podcast. I see how many you put out. It's like so many
I just,
conversations.
yeah,
How could
I
you
published,
possibly I don't remember them. So
I just
how
published
could I expect you?
you don't remember talking to me. Who were you?
I mean, I
Josh.
remember I have to actually, if I have, interviews with people over and, again and again, I have to sometimes, and I hate listening to my own interviews, but sometimes I
Yeah,
do go back in and listen because I want to make sure I'm not talking about the same thing. I have to make notes.
I just saw it and now I moved away from it. Darn it, darn it, darn it. I just
Well,
saw it.
I'm betting we talked about Dickens, but
I think we talked about the season change, honestly. It might have been why people celebrate the Yule time with the trees and the candles, and they're worried about the
yeah,
dark and the
we
outside and the
did. We totally
monsters,
did. We
right? Or
totally
we did
did.
that for something, but it really works for Christmas too, because the keeping people inside is the main priority, and then you
Okay,
have
so I
all of the
see. Okay, wait. Now I'm seeing we did supernatural folklore, of course. That's kind of my shtick. But I'm trying to look back all the way to. I'm looking on my phone, looking back at your December Mirage.
July
And okay,
27th.
speculating on speculative fiction number 15, spooky Christmas creature fun with Varla
Creature
Ventura.
fun.
That's what we did last year. So that's good. So we won't do creatures. We can talk about Charles Dickens
Charles
and his
Dickens.
obsession with Christmas ghosts. Have we
Was it an
talked about that
obsession?
before?
How many?
Oh,
Yeah, probably.
yes.
We've talked about so many things on
I
our podcast. Kind of run the gamut as far as
we talk about it all.
yeah, exactly. But I mean, it's Christmas Carol. Is it? Has he done this before? Has he written about ghosts besides that story? I mean, obviously that's his famous one, the Christmas Carol.
Yeah, so the Christmas Carol's his most famous one, but he actually used to put out this publication. It was called All Year Round, and it was sort of a journal of short stories and poems and reviews of plays and things like that. And there was always a Christmas edition. And in every Christmas edition, there would be sort of a new short story.
And the Carol
Almost
was a short story too. It was longer than a short story. How many words are we talking
The
about here?
Christmas Carol was more of a novel. I mean, that was a
No,
pretty lengthy.
I don't think it was novel per se. I think it was novelette, but
I think it was
short.
put, but I do believe it was put out as an individual book. Whereas these other stories often came out in like little shorts in part of this journal. So basically, he would do a Christmas edition of this journal that he published all year round, as the name implies. And he frequently would include a story that had to do with ghosts, Christmas ghosts. And it turns out that Dickens, there's quite a bit of when you think about a book or a story like The Christmas Carol, you can kind of see where the ghosts come into play. You don't always think of that as a ghost story, right? You think of it as a Christmas story because it has this moral in the end of, you know, appreciating what you have, but it really does have this kind of supernatural element to it. So one of
You
the
know what's just
most
interesting about it, though? I just realized that there is no afterlife in the Christmas Carol, is it? The ghosts aren't saying he's going to heaven. The ghosts aren't saying he's going to hell. The ghosts are saying that here's how you're affecting the people around you. And if you don't change, this is what's going to happen to them, right? More or less.
well,
It's not
and
saying you're going to stave
also
off death. You're not going to go to heaven or hell. But look at Tiny Tim and what your existence did for this guy or this little kid.
well, then I think it's also guilt. That's what I think that those ghosts, the ghost of Marley, his
Yeah.
former partner, who he slighted, and there's these ghosts come back to haunt him because they are his own guilt for being a
But I'm right,
miserly
though, right? They don't talk
person.
about heaven and hell in this story at all. There's no
No,
moral
Dickens
like
does
after.
not. In this, and I definitely stick a lot with his. So I have not his longer novels, but he doesn't really. He talks a lot about moral issues, but he doesn't talk about heaven versus hell in the
Doesn't.
same way.
No, he doesn't even do that in the Great Expectations, does he?
No, he really
Or in
doesn't.
Oliver
That
Twist.
was not his concern.
No,
And I think
he
he was,
wanted your machinations to make a difference in your own life, right? Or you
yeah,
could
he
make
was more
a difference.
concerned with the choices and of society, and being a member of sort of like the upper echelon of society. He saw a lot of grave injustices, and he saw a lot of things happening amongst his fellows that he didn't believe in. And this is why he wrote about poverty, and he wrote about, I mean, he'd kind of risen up from some of those things, and he felt like a lot of people were out of touch. And so, unlike a lot of writers of the time, he used, in a somewhat subtle fashion, he was kind of always teaching these, maybe not that subtle, but he was always teaching these moral lessons.
Well, he was not religious though at all. I mean, I know I'm kind of harping on that religious thing, but I think it's interesting given the time. 1843 is when he wrote A Christmas
Yeah, I
Carol.
mean, there's not a lot, as you said, there's not a lot of heaven, hell. There's also not a lot of there's a little bit of God sprinkled in there, but
Yeah.
sort of in a way that, like, it's on the money. People just say it. They don't necessarily. So there's not a lot of that, in at least in what I've read, but there's definitely, for me, being a supernaturalist and somebody who studies the paranormal and the paranormal arts.
Yeah.
I
Which
found,
doesn't you don't differ. I mean, you don't really separate that very far from religious though. Religious acts. The paranormal side of the world is really connected to the religious side of the world. They can't exist without each other.
well, I think they can. I think there's two different things. I mean, there's beliefs. There's that aspect of religion where there's belief. You have to have belief to believe that, something like a ghost is possible. But I think religion is used to sort of try and conduct people's behavior, whereas a belief in the paranormal isn't necessarily to conduct anyone's behavior. It's
Well,
just
that's
to,
true. I guess religion, that's not spirituality and paranormal, I guess, go
yes,
hand in
and I
hand,
think,
right?
yeah, and
Yeah, I think we
that's
talked about
something
this
about
before,
this.
where paranormal really does prey very heavily on the afterlife or dying, what happens after death.
Well, and I think you have with the spiritualist movement, which was popularized in sort of during that sort of mid to late Victorian era in the United States, and North America, and parts of, especially in the UK. You had the spiritualist movement where you had people really believing in communication with, so it was not just that there was life after death, or was there life after death. It was the belief that you could communicate with those deceased loved ones, and that they would have a message. And that was not always in alignment with what was taught in a church. However, it wasn't in conflict. So you would have people that, like, today you might think of somebody who's, really interested in the paranormal and, the psychic arts. You would probably put them more in like the witchy end of the spectrum. But back during the spiritualist movement, it didn't necessarily mean that you didn't go to church on Sunday, or that you didn't believe this dogma. Like, they weren't separate, although they were not mutually, they didn't weren't dependent on each other, I
So,
guess.
like this dude was not very religious. I'm looking at his Wikipedia page. Are you surprised?
Mm-mm.
No, right?
No, not at all. No, I'm not at all. In fact, that's something that I like about him.
Well, I mean, he said he expressed a distaste in it, but he explored it too. It seems like he sampled various, flavors of Christianity. Some people say that he did believe in the divinity of Jesus Christ. Other people don't think that he believed in the divinity. His son says he's a hardcore Christian person, but yet, we have his stories. And as you talk, the more I realize that he is moralizing about what existence is in a way, isn't it? Because the Christmas Carol is saying when your existence ends, people will continue living, and you will
Well,
have an impact in them,
there are some.
have impacted them, if not continuing to know what that impact is. And here's a
Well, and
glimpse.
I think he also had a penchant, like most writers of the, writers in general, but writers of the era. I think he had a penchant for some of the um, old ways and the old beliefs. So he's in the UK, and there are all of these sort of practices, these folkloric practices that bleed over into the modern Christian, Christmas ceremony. And
Yeah.
I think he was quite interested in those. And I think that comes across in these Christmas publications that he put out often had ghost stories. And one of the most famous ones that, well, I I don't know if it's the most famous, it's actually probably a little more obscure, but it's one that I've read extensively, is this one that was called, um it was called The Haunted House. And essentially, it's this wonderful kind of, it's sort of like a story within a story, and it's this wonderful trick of, it's got this a marvelous literary device, because what he's done is he puts this publication out, and then he does a Christmas edition.
Mhm.
Throughout the year, he is acting as editor. He is soliciting his fellow writers that he admires and he appreciates, and fellow playwrights, and they are sending in things to this journal, and he's writing little stories. So for this particular year, and I think it was in 1889, he for that year's Christmas edition, he asked all of these contributors that he had had throughout the year to participate in this story. And so the baseline of the story is that, um, a young man is traveling by train, and he goes to let this house over the Christmas holidays, over the 12 nights of Christmas, which are known to be a, very magical time. I think we've talked before about how thin the veil is at like times like Halloween, where, you know, ghosts and spirits and other kind of bogies and creatures are thought to be able to come through easier between the veil of between the living and the dead. So it was once believed could happen at Christmas time. And during the 12 nights of Christmas, which is basically like Christmas or Christmas Eve up until through January,
Yeah.
these nights were thought to be incredibly, magical, and that a lot of supernatural activity was afoot. And you actually had to be careful. Were you to go too far into the woods, you might see witches riding trolls and elves gallivanting around a big fire. And these were all, representations of paganism that the Christians were afraid of. And so it was, don't go into the woods this time. And meanwhile, the Christians are trying to claim this as this, holy holiday, this, resurrection or birth of Jesus, and trying to kind of overlap all of these wild pagan traditions of, burning away the coldness and darkness of winter and welcoming the light by
I
having
love it so
bonfires,
much, right? If you're a
cavorting,
pagan and
and
you're
partying.
worshiping all these gods and whatnot, and this
Oh, yeah,
priest comes in and says, "Hey, yo, bro, you know that story you've been telling forever? Well, it actually happened to this guy down here named Jesus or whatever." And
exactly.
I love it so much. And the pagan's like, "Really? Yeah, you got to worship this Jesus guy because he's gonna get upset if you don't." And they easily just switched
Exactly.
right over. It's so beautiful.
And it was a, divisive, but very, very smart, because um you have these pagan ceremonies. They've got crazy furs on. They're wearing, they're making, you know, offerings to the horned god for a positive new year, and all of these things are happening, right? And the priests are like hovering over in the side, thinking like, well, what are these pagans doing? This like horrific ceremony. And so it becomes, the tale is that those things are bad and those things are evil, and now that's the devil. And the best way to convert people is to have a holiday around the same time as that original holiday, offer them free food and drink and warmth, and basically punish them if they don't show up. So
You know,
in
it's really
time,
a shame that we don't have more details about the holidays they were having. I mean, I
oh,
guess
we
we
have
do. I
lots of
guess we can
details.
dig.
There's extensive records of, what the original sort of, what the Celts were doing, and how, the people were celebrating holidays around the world, and some of those practices are still into play. And
So
one
these
of
would be like this would be like 12 festival nights, right? I mean, they'll have bonfires on 12 nights and there'll be sacrifices or whatever they do.
Well, there weren't sacrifices, but there
Uh,
were offerings where you would make, an offering to a deity, depending on what part of the world you lived in, and who your deity was. But it was, all of these things were basic, came down to the basic survival of, making sure that you had food the following year. So
So
whatever you
incredible.
did was, all relating to the crops that you were going to grow and the what you were going to hunt and what you were going to harvest.
It was so important. Everything, right? It's
So
geared
important.
towards the calendar. It's geared towards food and sustenance and
I mean, right,
best
like at
ways
its
to make
base.
things last.
Absolutely. So
And it's an
back
oral
to
tradition too, because they don't write shit down. They're just memorizing these
so
stories and these
and that is
festivals.
part of the issue. I mean, what we have in terms of written record is a, anglicized biased version of what was observed. And so, and I know this from, writing about fairies and banshees and different creatures, is that anytime you read these accounts, you're reading, this an anglicized version of something that could have been, you know, from a different point of view, it would have looked quite different, that
And
it
we
would have
have lots
served.
of different Anglicized versions of the 12 Nights of Christmas. I mean, the song, for one, that's lasted throughout the ages. Now, here's Charles Dickens. We've already discussed that he's not Anglicized. He's kind of exploring what religions are out there and trying to see where he fits into the grand picture of things and questioning and whatnot. In fact, I don't even think the term existed, but he might be called a what? Not an atheist, but a what?
A- Agnostic? I
Agnostic.
mean, I feel like agnostic would probably fit him better, and I can see that he
But he doesn't
believed
moralize
that
about it
there
though,
was
does he? He doesn't ask
something.
questions about God or Jesus or anything in his stories. He's not really, he's asking questions about his own actions. So I'm really curious, the 12 Nights of Christmas that he's writing, how does it come off?
So this particular story is what he does is he drops like explanations about the 12 nights and the sort of supernatural properties, but without going into it extensively. He just sort of drops these little nuggets in there. And so just so the story is this guy, he goes and he takes a train and he lets this house that is supposed to be haunted, and he decides to take it up for rent over Christmas, because that is when it is said that, wells run red with blood and animals can talk, and it's widely believed that this is a highly supernatural time. Dickens doesn't say this in the story, but this is sort of the
Yeah,
context.
this is the context. I gotcha.
That was another guy who talked about the wells running red with blood. That was a man named William Wirt Sykes, who was the consulate general in Wales. He was from the U.S. and he was at the consulate in Wales and collected all of this folklore and married a Welsh woman. And his accounts are some of the best accounts of sort of the old ways of Wales and parts of England, because he was sort of immersing himself in the culture in a slightly different way. He wasn't actually studying it. He was there acting as, this consulate, but was immersed in the culture and has all of these. His descriptions are a little less, I guess, biased and ethnocentric than others, I
Because
think.
he's an outside observer. He's looking at the
He's an
culture
outside
through the lens
observer, but
of,
he's not looking down his nose at it.
yeah,
And
that's
that
the
is
cure.
something that you see a lot. You see a lot of like, oh, the peasants. This is a peasant account.
And he's an American, so he comes from peasant stock. Everybody does. I mean,
Well, and much in
rarely.
the way that we still today, we look at, indigenous people's stories and, First Peoples and Native Americans, and we just say, oh, well, that's this outrageous tale that they came out of a clamshell. And we just sort of think like, oh, those are those
Well,
stories. Those are their
yeah,
origin
I mean,
stories,
it's
right?
the same as no, what is Jonah and the whale? I mean, it's so it's as awesome as that stuff. I mean, I
For
love
some reason we can accept this arc scenario, but we can't accept the clam scenario.
I
It's
accept it all
like
now, just as religious history. Was it pish posh, right? I mean, just it's telling a story of something important that needed to be carried forward, and they don't have books. So how do you do it? You create an interesting narrative that people aren't going to forget. God, I love the turtle, right? The earth turtle. I mean, you have to understand the turtle floats in the universe, and how do you do that? It's a big turtle. You know what
and
I
it's
mean?
just as valid of an explanation as anything
As
else.
anything else. I mean, I don't even think the
Probably
Jewish
more
people even
so.
tried to explain it, did they? And we
Right.
don't. We know the Greeks did because there was math. They knew the Earth was round. They knew how it functioned in the universe and the solar system and whatnot, kind of vaguely. And then it gets better and better and better, and that story gets better and better and better. And it stops being about monsters and gods and tricksters or whatever, and it starts becoming more about numbers and equations of mathematics.
Yeah, and distance, and yeah, exactly.
That's a
So,
calendar. I mean, that's what religion is one giant freaking calendar.
yeah, right? So, we're all operating on, like, this calendar that once upon a time was directly tied with, and still does to a certain extent, but because of modern, ways of growing things and producing food and importing food from all around the world, things have changed. But, that calendar is essential to our survival as a species, because in the spring is, you plant, and in the summer you water, and in the fall you harvest, and in the winter you store, and you parse out. I mean, those are like um the basic cycles.
Yeah,
But so back to this haunted house. So here we are in this haunted house, and this is why I think you'll really appreciate this story, because it does have this fantastic literary device, and it would be such a fun experiment to do something like this. So so this man in the story, the guy goes into this house, and he invites friends to join him in the house, and he sets up the scenario. Here's what we're going to do every night, between, for the next 12 nights. We're going to stay the night in this house, and we're going to make our own observations about whether or not we think this house is haunted and who it is haunted by. We're all going to be in our own rooms. We'll come together for supper and we can have conversation, but we're not to talk about any experience that we have unless something untoward happens. Otherwise, we're kind of on our own with our observations. And on the 12th night, we will sit down together and we will share our observations. This is his scenario.
I love it.
So what Dickens does, Dickens the man, is he writes the intro. He's the guy who lets the house, and he assigns out a room to all of his favorite writers of the time. And so you end up with this fantastic collection of basically short little stories that are the ghost in the parlor room, the ghost in the clock room, the ghost in the cupboard room. And it's almost like, Clue. It's like everybody gets their room, and then they all write these stories. And then he also writes the closing piece, in which the captain shares his story. And, Mrs. So and so, I forget, but there was this woman named Hesba Stretton, and she was a very famous writer to him, a famous writer at the time, and she writes her piece from, the point of view of the ghost in her room. I'm trying to remember what room she gets assigned, but they each get um their own room, and they all kind of have this wonderful different perspective, and together collectively they make this I guess novella length sort of publication that he puts out at Christmas time, that is laying out the scenario. And it's fantastic because it's Dickens is the main character, and he's sort of bringing all these people together, and they each have their own character. One of the writers is Queen Victoria's favorite poet, and so she writes hers all in verse. Another one is this seafaring man who writes about being haunted by a candle, and his is actually this metaphorical haunting in which he has PTSD from being tortured by pirates. So it's like all different points of view and all different perspectives. And I like to think of Dickens as sort of like the editor in this situation, saying to his friends, okay, this is what I'm going to give you. You can write anything you want, and then seeing what they come back with. And I just think it's a very underrated and not that well-known piece of literature that brings together all of these voices of the time. And
Yeah, it's interesting. It doesn't even show up if you look at like the 12th night.
so
The
it's
12 Nights of Christmas. I mean, it does not show up as something that's being reflected as in literature, but the Christmas Carol does.
Yes, so I
Only because
believe
he
it was
mentions, yeah.
originally I'm trying to remember what it was originally published as, and I'm looking in my book here because I've written about it a couple times, and I've actually did an ebook version of it where we went through all of the houses. I have it right here. Let me tell you a bit more of the facts, since I have an actual. Okay, so in my book, in Paranormal Parlor, I call this section Dickens Haunted House Party. because he basically throws like a haunted house party for all of his literary
Yeah.
friends. Um, so this was okay. So Dickens' Christmas ghosts were rampant in his 1894 pamphlet Christmas Stories, a holiday supplement to All Year Round. The Haunted House, so that's what it was called. It was called The Haunted House, if you're looking for it. And so this is 18. I thought it was 1889, but it looks like it might have been a little later than that, 1894. So if you look up Charles Dickens' The Haunted House, and you can find all of the different authors, or you can look in if you look on Amazon, like there's Kindle versions that I worked on that sort of pulled in all of the different people. And in mine, I just have brief introductions about who the author was and why Dickens chose that author. For example, here's one I'll give you. The ghost in the picture room is channeled by Adelaide Ann Proctor.
Oh, she's
Proctor
pretty.
was Proctor was a poet and philanthropist who died at the young age of 38 in 1864. She was a native Londoner who held the honor of being Queen Victoria's favorite poet. In Proctor's time, she was considered second only to Alfred Lord Tennyson in poet popularity, and he began
Interesting.
publishing her in All Year Round when she was a teenager. So The Ghost in the Picture Room, hers is a long rhyming poem. Then we have Elizabeth Gaskell, who wrote The Ghost in the Garden Room. And that's a sort of a story of a ghostly judge. We have Wilkie Collins, who you might know the name of. Wilkie Collins
God,
wrote
dude, this
the
is
Woman
so.
in White.
Adelaide is the contemporary of Mary Shelley.
Yeah, she's a very interesting person. In fact, this entire scenario with all of these different people and a few others who aren't in this particular collection, but who worked with Dickens, who I haven't done a great deal of research, but I know enough about the All Year Round Christmas publication, or the All Year Round publication, and then the Christmas edition that he always did had some of the brightest and, um, you know, they were known in their day, and in part because Dickens was already an established writer at this point, and so he was showcasing these authors that he admired. And today we don't recognize these names as much, but
Yeah.
Wilkie Collins did The Woman in White, which is one of the most famous ghost stories. It was actually a play that he wrote, and he and Dickens were friends, and they wrote a number of things. So I think that what happened is he actually collected these over a period of time and
Yeah.
then put them together into this Christmas publication when he had them
All of them.
all.
Yeah. I mean, we're dealing like with mail by horse, maybe a train. I'm not sure what they had. I'm
Yeah,
just blown away by the fact that Mary Shelley lied, right? I mean, she was hiding her gender when she published Frankenstein, and then this woman comes along. Like, I guess it's the next generation, though.
so yes, she was. Are you talking about Adelaide Ann Proctor?
As far as being appreciated for her, yeah, exactly, that woman.
Right. So she was a little bit later, and I don't think she was as appreciated as she probably
Shelley.
would have been more appreciated had she been a man, if she had written as a as a man. But the thing is she had one of those scenarios where her poems got into the right hands, and she became Queen Victoria's favorite poet.
I know
And
it's so
Queen
interesting.
Victoria, I mean, we call it the Victorian era. It influenced architecture, it influenced dress, it influenced attitudes toward the supernatural. I mean, all of these things were Victoria's influence. And so I personally, however, had never heard of this woman and was delighted and amazed to find that she was Queen Victoria's favorite poet.
So
So
cool.
this is what I liked about the whole scenario. One, it was this marvelous haunted house scenario and this great kind of Christmas story. But two, it was this amazing literary kind of feat and collaboration, and basically gave these writers this prompt, and they could do whatever they wanted with it. And it's such a cool scenario. If you can imagine a writer of today doing something like that, saying, "Hey, I want my friend, I want Neil Gaiman to do a little chapter here on this. I'm going to give him the parlor room," or whatever kind of construct you have, and it's just it's a wonderful idea for a work of fiction, in a way of kind of, rather than just say here are the best short stories of 2018, right? You've got like this collection with this, writers, we love prompts, right? We love
Yeah.
some kind of perimeter within which to write. Otherwise, we're unleashed, and we're untethered, and we have a hard time, holding onto the branch before we float off into the universe. But if we have a scenario, especially an assigned scenario,
Yeah, I
then we
totally
do a
dig
lot
this.
better.
I appreciate what this is. I mean, I'm looking at Elizabeth Gaskell and then Adelaide and I think Hasba. These are three women that maybe history wouldn't remember otherwise, right? I mean, I was looking at
It's
Hasba.
sad to
She's got like,
say, but yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
6 books. I mean, I've never heard of her before, but now she's with Charles Dickens. So, I mean, if you're interested in Charles Dickens, who has a wide range of literature, he pulled these people through history with him. It's pretty damn cool.
Yeah, it's really cool. Right. And so then, he just basically, what happens is they all get together and they tell these stories. I've read every one of them. They're all very different. Probably my favorite is, it's actually really difficult to choose which one is my favorite because they're all extremely different. As I said, one is in rhyme, one is in this kind of scenario where this guy goes on a ship and he is haunted by the ghost of a candle, and that's sort of how his story starts out, that he is haunted by that many people are haunted by ghosts or haunted by their past, but I am haunted by one solitary candle. And he kind of goes on to talk about how he was in this scenario where he almost died on this ship, and this candle was used to torture him. And to this day, every time a candle is lit, he is taken right back to that sort of horrible moment. And it's just, you have no idea where he's going with this until you're there, and there's a keg of gunpowder on a ship, and he's tied up, and there's a candle, and then you realize where he's going. And it's all very Victorian, so it takes a while to get there.
Yeah.
That's a lot of fun to read.
Looking at audio versions on YouTube. I'm like, I'm not a fan of going back in time and reading literature from 100 or more years ago. I think the language changes significantly, right? Do you think that it helps a writer in modern age to read the classics? Think it helps you, right?
I think so. For me, what I did in particular with this collection when I came upon it, and I had proposed this to the publisher because they wanted to do this selection of like e-shorts.
Yeah.
And at first it was like, do we do it all as one? And I said, the problem with doing it all as one is that, you're just going to get lost by the end of chapter one. And that's why we did each chapter as an individual with an introduction, because that is how I made sense of it. I had a scenario, once I read them all multiple times in order to get what the scenario was, then I was able to think, okay, if I were walking into this and knew nothing about it, I would appreciate it. You're going to appreciate the chapter by Adelaide Ann Proctor a lot more, knowing that she was this underrated poet who was, beloved by Queen Victoria. You're just
Yeah.
going to, right? Because now, otherwise, she's just going to seem like all the other, convoluted Victorian language stories that are out there.
Queen
So,
Victoria was lots later than this too. In 1843 was George III. When did Victoria become Victoria?
the Victorian era, I think, started in the mid 1800s.
Yeah, I'm looking at this woman being dead when Queen Victoria. I just looked up Victoria's Secret.
Oh, are you
You love
looking
like
up?
Google.
No, Queen Victoria reigned from until 18 late 1800s. I think 1901 or something like that is when her reign ended officially. Oh, but you're talking about
1837. I'll tell you, when did she take the throne? I'm looking at when this book was
1830s,
published.
I think. 1830s.
I'm looking at. I keep using the same tab.
So the Dickens collection, as it was published as a collection, was published in the late 1800s during the height of the Victorian era.
was like
Now,
1859
but
is when it was
but
published.
Adelaide Ann Proctor had died
Yeah, she was dead
probably
already. I
even
was gonna
before it
say
came out.
1851 is when she died.
Yeah, well, so I think he actually published other things by Adelaide Ann Proctor long before that, but this particular collection as a whole, presented as a whole, didn't come out probably until after her death.
God, man, that's how it works too. You're in the void, oblivion, and freaking Queen Victoria is digging your poetry. You're already
Yeah, and I
dead,
think that
buried.
was during her active. I think they overlap, but remember, Adelaide died very young, and
Yeah,
Queen
yeah, she was like
Victoria lived to be very old.
very old.
So they only overlapped for a short time. But it's
That's
like Oprah. Oprah picks your book, and it's like,
exactly
boom.
right. I think that's exactly what it is. It's like James Fry didn't die,
It
and
totally,
he just
it
died
totally is.
instead.
Yeah, but anyway, back to your
That's the only
question.
Oprah Winfrey book I know. I don't know any others
Oh,
besides.
right. Well, there's been she's still picking them. But actually, back to your question, do I think it's important for modern writers to
I mean,
read
look how
classics?
I answer my. I'll add to it and say that I think it's really freaking fascinating how you can break this story down just by this one writer. You know
Yeah.
what I mean? It's so interesting that that's an unknown story that I didn't know about.
I
And
know.
it's
That's why it became so fascinating to me. That's why I became obsessed with. I never have been much of a Charles Dickens fan. Not that I eschewed him the way I don't like Hemingway, for example,
what
but
you're not allowed not to like Hemingway.
I am
Sorry,
100%
not
allowed and
especially
just declared it
being
publicly.
in Minnesota, especially. What is you are supposed to like Hemingway? You're supposed to be like homeboys with him.
I don't like Hemingway. I don't like his
That's
writing.
horrible. It's horrible.
I don't like his writing.
It's
That's all there is
unforgivable.
to it. So in any case,
Why don't is it like masculine? Is that why?
it's boring to me.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I find it boring. I find the short stories far too long.
It's interesting though because I don't think I could read. I don't know if I could go back and read The Haunted House with the same reason, but you don't find that boring. You like this era of
No,
writing,
I did get bored partway through it,
that you.
which is why I said to the publisher, we can't do it all in one because even I got bored halfway
Yeah,
through it. And I'm not a huge Dickens fan. I mean, I have nothing against him, and I've of course like everyone read like certain or familiar with certain stories. He's actually quite a good writer, and his introduction is lovely. It's just lovely. He writes this wonderful introduction about how he's taking this train to this haunted house, and he said most haunted houses, and he describes like your typical haunted house, and then he describes this place, and it's not like that at all. It's actually quite lovely, and so he doesn't believe that it's haunted. So it kind of sets up with this like classic Victorian era haunted house story. Usually it's this decrepit place that no one will stay the night, and this is this lovely place in the countryside that he could rent really cheaply, but that is all the locals say is haunted. And but I think I couldn't sit down. I did because it was a project. I sat down
yeah,
and read it beginning to end. But were I to just be doing that because I'm sitting around for pleasure, I really needed that break. And so I inserted those breaks myself of like, okay, next up, you're going to read. So if I were ever to, republish it as its own and an entirety as a little publication, I think it's important to have that commentary, at least in the beginning of the chapter, because it makes it much more interesting. And
yeah.
this is, I know we've talked before about the thing with the Mark Twain and the woman channeling the entire novel by Ouija board. And I wish we could just say what
Jap
episode that
Harone.
is. If anyone's listening, you can go back and look up Jap Harone and you can listen to that speculation.
I'm sure
Um,
we're basically one of the only three people I've ever talked about Jap Harone. So
yeah.
you,
So, but
me, and
that
Wikipedia.
also, that's another scenario in which I wasn't particularly, um, interested in Twain, and I became more interested in him because of trying to determine whether or not how Twain like this novel actually was. And I've
Yeah,
read it multiple times, and every time I get a little something out of it. But I think just going back to your big question about whether or not I think it's important, I think it depends on what kind of writer you are
yeah.
and what you write about. Now, in my case, I'm researching hidden paranormal history for a book.
Yeah.
Then it totally makes sense for me to be reading, this whole collection by Charles Dickens. And then my job is to make it interesting to you. So you don't have to read it. Now, maybe you want to, but now you know about it and you know about these other people. And that's kind of how, like, my role as a writer is to sort of bring to light some of these little hidden bits of history, especially as they might relate to ghosts or paranormal.
It's also a
Um,
Christmas story. I mean, I was just wondering, I'm thinking like Brick Moon asked me to write a Christmas story, and I wrote them an Einstein crazy thing, and they
I want to
loved
read
it. I'll check out my website. I
that.
have
Okay.
it linked under they had they audio booked it, and there's going to be an anthology. But anyway, they wanted Christmas stuff, and every holiday, every publisher wants Christmas themed stuff. Everybody across the board. That's hundreds and hundreds of stories about Christmas, right? It gets
Right.
published every single year. And here is a short story anthology themed around Christmas, ghosts for that matter. And I think it's really interesting. We started this conversation, we talked about the 12 nights and how during that 12 nights, I don't know, the film, it's the wrong word, what I'm looking for.
Yeah, the veil, the
The
film.
veil,
The
yeah,
veil.
the
The veil is
veil is
thin.
thinner. And you can see the ghosts. And every one of these people have a different story during that 12 nights. It's genius. It's unique, right?
Yeah.
I don't think they had things like that then, these anthologies. Right now, it seems to be everybody's writing an anthology about Bigfoot or Godzilla making love to Mothra or something. I don't know. They're all these anthologies. They're all
Yeah.
themed around zombies or whatever. But do you have anthologies themed like this in this era? Because in terms of importance,
Well,
this seems to
technically, this
be.
was an anthology.
It
This was an
was.
anthology of his own making, right? I mean,
Yeah.
it was a collection of all of these stories themed on being in this haunted house, but it
Yeah.
was however many chapters, I can't remember. There's like 10 chapters, so there's 10 different writers and 10 different ghosts. Although I think he takes one of the ghosts, so it's one less than that.
Three, actually, is three.
He does the intro, he does the one of the ghosts, he does the final chapter,
He does Mortals in the House, which might be the
which is the
intro.
intro. That's the intro.
And then he does the Ghost and Master B's Room. And then he
Yep.
does the
That's the
Ghost.
yes, that's the yep, that's sort of the childlike ghost. Mhm.
And then the Ghost in the Corner Room is also him.
Oh, that's right. That's right. So what's cool too is that the scenario that he sets up is that it's this old house and this is like kind of Downton Abbey like, but there's all of these bells, and the bells are all the bells that the bell would ring and the servants would see the bell and it would be Master B's
Oh
room
yeah.
or the parlor room or the cupboard room or whatever it was. And so he sort of talks about that's how he identifies all the characters that are forthcoming in the collection, as by looking at these bells and then the bells ringing, and that's the connection to the story. But I have to tell you, I recently was out for a stroll and found a collection of Dickens Christmas stories in a little free library, which of course I snatched it up. And I was so excited because I was like, surely this is a whole collection of Dickens Christmas only, beautiful little hardcover book. And not a mention of this 12 nights of Christmas in a haunted house scenario.
Were they all
Oh,
Dickens stories about Christmas?
yeah, they are. Here, wait. Yeah,
Okay.
let me
Well,
grab it.
I thought the ending of that story was going to be and Nary One was by Dickens or something weird like that.
No, let me. I swear it's right next to me. Hang on, I'm gonna dash over and grab it so I can tell you what's in
This
it.
goes into another question I was having, whether or not Dickens has written other Christmas stories besides the haunted house and
Yeah, actually,
12
I
Nights
just
of
realized
Christmas.
that
I mean,
I'm modern and I can bring my computer with me here. So it's Dickens, and I don't have to put the phone down and run and get it. Dickens at Christmas is what it is. It's a vintage classic, a selection of seasonal writings. You're not going to believe how many. These are all Dickens. The
how many?
Christmas books: A Christmas Carol, The Chimes, The Cricket on the Hearth, The Battle of Life, The Haunted Man and the Ghost Bargain. From Household Words: A Christmas Tree, A Christmas Dinner, What Christmas Is as We Grow Older. The Seven, I just found this, so I haven't had a chance to read them all. The Seven Poor Travelers. From A Round of Stories by the Christmas Fire, The Poor Relations Story, The Child Story. From Another Round of Stories by the Christmas Fire, the school board story, nobody's story. So he doesn't actually have anything from all year round, the Christmas edition, which is where this haunted house
I kind of
collection
like
came from.
22 of them. Are there more than?
So are you saying that I should pitch the publisher? That's a good idea, actually. Pitch my publisher and say we should put it out as a Christmas edition with commentary.
I think so. I think that would work very well. I think it would work as, I think you could maybe modernize it too. It's obviously does not copyright. Nobody even
Right.
knows
Well,
about it.
you could the what I actually like when
Bring all these characters out, these hidden gems of history,
just
these
having
outline.
footnotes, right? Like maybe there's a footnote about when, she says this particular word and it actually meant something else at the time and it was specifically a nod to Queen Victoria or something like that. Anyway, this is a huge long book with tons and tons of stories, and it's not even all of his Christmas stuff. I know that for a fact because
because
told you about
he was a publisher. Every year he would probably write a Christmas story.
Exactly. So he was publisher, he was an editor, he was a writer, and he had Christmas scenarios. But I think a lot of the, like, one of the stories here, it's actually it says it's from the Pickwick Papers, which I never read, but it's called The Story of the Goblins Who Stole a Sexton. And it is actually a goblin story that involves, a little bit of they're in a graveyard and there's all kinds of strange things happening in it. I don't remember that in the Pickwick Papers. I don't think I ever read that in its entirety. I just probably read the summary or whatever. So yeah, he was a total Christmas guy, and I encourage people to definitely look beyond the Christmas Carol, because up until 10 years ago, that was the only Dickens
Christmas thing.
Christmas thing I associated with him.
It's a blind side to these literary giants, right? I mean, they've written
I love the blind side. Absolutely. That's my favorite side. It's like, I have a whole section in the my most recent book that's just like, it's basically the secret lives of upstanding citizens. And it's all of these writers who, were architects by day and horror writers by night. And
people, I've had 120, I just published you today. I pushed out our last conversation. That's how behind I am. That last time we talked, I just published today. But 120 different conversations. Some of them are duplicates with professional people that have different jobs during the day. Engineers mainly. Math people are just a gigantic, they have I guess they just can't turn their brain off, so they write novels in their free time.
Or they just have it. You got to make ends meet with your day job, or maybe you want your day job. I mean, I think you and I probably both ultimately have the same goal, which is to write all day in our pajamas without having to leave the house.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I do anyway. Well, no, that's not true.
Okay, to make a living at writing all day in our pajamas, right?
In pajamas. Comfortable living.
Comfortable living. And sweatpants. It doesn't have to be pajamas. I'm just saying.
Central Park West. I want that address.
Nobody tells you what to do except your editor, and that's okay, because writers have to have somebody telling them what to do a little bit.
Very true. That's why I have a wife.
A little bit.
She just tells me what to do.
Absolutely. Exactly. Someone who can keep, but you need that creative relationship with an editor, or an agent can also do that too, that basically bosses you around just enough, but because they appreciate and love you, they're trying to better you. That's why they're bossing you around.
Yeah. Exactly. I don't have it. It's just me. And then I let my wife read it, and she lets me know grammatically how I've messed up, but then we're both lost. We have no clue. Unfortunately, this year, I'm sitting on top of a mountain of fiction that got rejected from various magazines, and I think it could find a home. I think all of these stories could find a home, but now in my mind, I need to go back and redo them. You know what I mean? I need to relook at them, and it's exhausting to think of like 50 stories as my backlog of I need to do this.
Okay, so that is the other demon in every writer's closet, is the revision demon.
Yeah.
The self-doubt demon pokes the revision demon until that demon wakes up, and then the next thing you know, you've taken something and you've torn it apart, because the revision demon thought that that must be why the self-doubt demon let it out to begin with. So you're just like, it's a constant
If you
battle for
start a
sure.
revision and nobody's read it, it's still a revision until somebody else reads it. I've done that. I can't send it to anybody because I have edited sentences deep into the story. And once you do that, there are now contradictions and you have to find them. And every time that you do that, you can take a break. You can't remember what the contradictions are and you have to start over from the very beginning. And you create more contradictions, unfortunately. And if you don't make it to the end of the story, that's
Yes, and
probably
for myself, a lot of my writing, because I write on nonfiction subjects that I've researched, it's not that, like, I have a whole mess of fiction writing that I struggle with constantly. But with the nonfiction writing, you can give yourself a scenario that actually you can kind of self-create those parameters by creating a table of contents. You can't
yeah,
really do that
yeah.
with fiction writing. You can't
You
really create a
can,
table of contents. You can do
but
it.
you can't do it within a chapter, and that gets kind of confusing.
Yes,
Like a longer
exactly.
works,
Exactly.
I'll take a ladder of all of the various pieces that I have in there because there'll be like 50 long short stories, and I'll have the titles, and I'll be able to go back and forth between those sections, and they can be anywhere from 4 pages to 20 pages. But within those stories, I won't know the beats or whatnot, and that's where the gobbledygook can start developing. As if no, there's 20 pages, I change something, and then it stops making sense for like the
Well,
rest of the novel.
to bring it back to this idea of whether or not it's important to read, the classics, or and I don't think you have to read every, I don't believe in those, like, 10 books every writer must read kind of scenario or lists. But I do think that what happens is you are able to see, and like for myself, and I think I've told you this before, like I've read Dracula and Frankenstein at various points in my life, Frankenstein especially, and it has meant something, and I have seen something different in it at different stages in my life, from an angst-ridden teen to a older woman writing about horror, and seeing kind of the accomplishments of her in a more societal way, right? So like it means something different. And so I do
Yeah,
think like something like, even reading something like a Dickens work, or whatever kind of classic, Hemingway, whatever it is, even if you struggle through it, you will see that there's a reason that it's known. You may not think it's the best thing you've ever written, but it might give you some ideas
it
on
warrants
plot
investigating, right?
structure,
You should
conclusion, how to
you
end
should
your.
look at why that was popular a little bit because you know it.
Right.
If it's creeping into your zeitgeist, there's something significant happening.
Right, and
Uh,
it could just be, you read a random excerpt of it and try and appreciate the another writer that I don't love to sit down and read, but whom I respect, and I do respect Hemingway, but Jack London is another writer whom I have
Adventure
utmost
writer,
respect for, and he had
right?
a policy of writing 1,000 words a day.
He died of that. That's what I heard anyway. He died of exhaustion
But he had
or
this
an
ability
inflamed liver.
to, he sort of self-created this whole world in this beautiful ranch where he lived, and with his wife, and they had this, and he, went on all of these adventures, but he made a living, and he treated his writing. What I
Like a
take away
job.
from that is that he treated his writing like a business, like a
Yeah.
job. It was serious to him. And that's something that I think a lot of writers struggle with, is that without the confidence, you treat it as a hobby, or you consider it a hobby rather than your profession. And so there's a
The one thing
mindset.
I've noticed as well with talking to all people that most people have written a novel that I talk to. The ones that don't have that work ethic. The ones that do know that they don't put in the time, they're not going to produce the material. And if they don't produce the material, they don't have anything to work with. And it's
Right.
having the thing to work with that's the most important. Is it a thing that I can do something with? Yes, then great. If it's vaporware of just I might write a novel one day, someday I'll finish a novel, that's not putting the work in. That first one's so hard to put the work into because you're not sure how to actually put the work into it.
It is. It is. And even if you were to, like, it's a little different also, because with fiction, you sell on the finished product. You
Yeah.
might be able to go in and edit and move things around, but you sell on the finished product. With nonfiction, you can sell on the finished product, and it's to your advantage. The more you have done, the better.
Yeah,
But you can also sell on a pitch,
I
a
know.
really, really good, really fleshed out pitch. You
I
can
want to
sell.
work with. I'm
And
actually thinking about doing nonfiction stuff for Tor, only because they have open
oh,
submissions for it,
yeah.
and they have a
Well,
list of
actually, I
stuff they
think with
want.
your
I
with
like
your
that stuff.
mindset and the way that you look at different people and their approach to things, I actually could see you writing, something that's like a collection of similar to what your podcasts do, like the origin stories and the stories on creativity and kind of like those different, you always ask these questions like, well, what is creativity? Why would somebody be doing this? Why is this religion, this overarching theme? I mean, I
Yeah,
could
how
see
does it
you
affect? I
actually
love it.
turning that into a work of fiction, and you have all these contacts. You could get people to, you know, agree to
Oh yeah, that's
permissions.
how I make my stories, right? I mean, I try to make these scenarios and dig deep and try to figure out what's happening. I love that a lot.
Yeah, no, I could absolutely see you being, and so when you think of nonfiction, don't always think of it as a not creative endeavor, because there's a way to really get your own beliefs and writing in there. Like, for example, in every book that I write, if I include other people's stories, or I'm still weaving it all together. I'm writing the introduction, I'm retelling these tales, I'm choosing what I want people to know about. So I am choosing to tell people about Charles Dickens' haunted house and why. And so there's this way of being able to get your message out. And the key about that is that with nonfiction, and this is why you might also like it, with nonfiction, if you have this scenario you've pitched, you basically gave yourself these parameters. And now you have a publisher
Yeah, somebody
waiting with a
cheering you on.
deadline. And
That's
then
what
you're,
actually I will say, having a deadline is the most miraculous thing on the face of the planet. I'm
yep,
working on another story right now for the same publisher, and it's going to be a long one. It's going to be
yep.
10,000
Oh,
words, and
well, and the
we got to
deadline
get
gives
going.
you here's the fundamental thing that the deadline gives a creative person. And it's not the fear.
Uh-oh.
A deadline gives a creative person confidence,
Yep.
because somebody else is waiting to
Yep.
read what they wrote.
And that's what I do this for as an audience. I mean, I do it for putting stuff out there for people
Yes.
to enjoy to read.
Writers are
And
the most introverted extroverts on the planet. Right?
yeah,
We are just like, don't make me like go around in public and prance around on stage, but I will tell you everything about me, and in these written
yep.
words you will know things you can't unknow.
I've done the stage thing though. I've done the stand-up comedy thing for a second too. It is the most intimidating, fearful, nightmarish, give me PTSD thing I've ever had to do. I still have thoughts about how horrible I was on the stage. So I don't ever want to do it again. I took one time. That's it.
Well, I think you could do something amazing with nonfiction, and the thing is you could do nonfiction that complements your fiction.
Yeah,
So
that's what I'm aiming for. I mean, the difficult thing is just developing that type of style because I have a blog, so I'm starting to publish more of the bloggy type things, see if I can develop that story sense. Tor puts up not great stuff. I mean, it's not always good. It's like listing sometimes, the 10 greatest novels of 2018. It's like, wow, really? You paid somebody to write that? I could write that.
yeah, exactly. You could write that and you could get paid for it. I mean, that's the thing, is like,
I talk to people all year
gift
round
horse.
about, yeah. What's that?
I said gift horse.
Right?
It's like, okay, someone's gonna pay you for that. That's
Yeah, the fiction is distracting though, and then after I finish the contract piece, it's kind of like, okay, now I want the next contract piece. I don't like writing on spec anymore. I want to be able to get paid when I
yeah.
finish writing something. That's just like the best feeling ever. Turning the corner on that in my career was amazing. You know,
Yes. Yes, 100%. Well, I think, I would wholeheartedly encourage you, and I'm really, really good at writing proposals for nonfiction stuff. So I'd be happy to help you with that.
I would love to see what you would put together for, or what you would suggest for a proposal. I'll send you some ideas, and maybe I don't know if
Yeah,
I
and I can send you what a proposal what my proposal looked like for, my last book. Just so you can see. But yeah, I
Yeah.
have examples of, I mean, I think I still have that. I got to
Best
do
com.
my own, and that's the other thing is that I have two things that I'm working out, and I haven't pitched either one of them to my publisher. And I think, well, if I don't pitch it soon, it's not going to come out till 2020. It probably won't. It probably would come out in 2020 anyway because I would get it done in 2019. So, I gotta.
Unless you have a burst of productivity. What one is Pirates, right?
Yeah, Pirates is really probably going to win out. I mean, Pirates should win out.
What's
My
the other one?
best-selling book of all of the books is the Mermaid book, and I just think the Pirates would just go right along with it. It's like one of those, just like mermaids, you don't have to believe in anything to love mermaids. And I think that the Pirates are the same thing. Pirates are this real, they're real. Pirates are real today, and they have that same kind of appeal and lore.
Well,
So
they say not to do this, but it's too bad you didn't finish it this year because of Aquaman. Have that cross promotional thing happening.
maybe my publisher can push forward the Mermaid book.
And you can rename it Aquaman.
Yeah. I just put it in like the keywords on my blog or something. That's a good.
Aqua,
Aquaman.
MEN.
Crazy mermaids.
Crazy mermaids.